Hey guys, tonight we explore the story of a man who had everything the world said should make him happy, and who walked away from all of it to find out why it didn't. Together, as we begin with a prince in an ancient Indian palace, surrounded by beauty and comfort and love, who looked out one day at the world outside his walls and could not unsee what he saw, and whose inability to unsee it changed the course of human history. Right now, as you're watching this, someone else is watching it too. A different country, a different time zone, a different life, but the same quiet hour. Tonight we explore the story of the prince who sat under a tree until he understood. Together. If this is your first video here, take a look around, subscribe if it feels like home, and leave a comment, your location, your time. That small act of saying, "I'm here," does something. It reminds all of us that we're not as alone in this as the dark sometimes makes us feel. Dim the lights, maybe pull a blanket over yourself if there's one nearby. Let's begin. In the 5th century before the Common Era, in the foothills of the Himalayas in what is now the border region of Nepal and India, a boy was born into a royal family of the Shakya clan. His name was Siddhartha Gautama, and from the moment of his birth, he was surrounded by everything that wealth and power and love could provide. His father, King Suddhodana, had been told by a court sage that his son would become either a great king or a great spiritual teacher. Determined that his son would rule rather than renounce, the king made a decision. He would build a world for Siddhartha in which there was nothing to renounce. The palace at Kapilavastu was made as beautiful as human ingenuity could make it. Gardens filled with flowers and fountains, musicians and dancers to fill the hours with pleasure, food of extraordinary variety and quality, the company of young people who were healthy, beautiful, and carefully selected to present only the most appealing face of human existence. Sickness was hidden, old age was hidden, death was hidden, poverty was hidden. Everything that might disturb the prince's contentment was removed from his sight before he could encounter it, and Siddhartha grew up inside this carefully constructed world. He learned and excelled. He married a beautiful woman named Yasodhara and had a son, Rahula. He had, by every external measure, a complete and fortunate life. But here is the psychological truth that his father's careful construction missed. You cannot protect a sensitive mind from the knowledge that the world contains suffering by simply removing suffering from its view. The absence of visible suffering is not the same as peace. A mind that has been given everything except honest engagement with reality does not become contented. It becomes restless. It becomes aware in a way it cannot quite articulate that something is missing, and what is missing is precisely the truth about where it actually lives. Siddhartha, in his beautiful palace, was not at peace. He was comfortable, and comfortable is not the same thing. One day, the exact circumstances vary across different versions of the tradition, but the psychological core of the story remains constant. Siddhartha left the palace. He went out into the city of Kapilavastu, and what he saw there in the streets outside his carefully managed world changed everything. He saw an old man, not old in the way the palace presented it, not the dignified elder with wisdom and authority, old in the raw physical reality of it, bent, frail, the body having simply worn down over time. And Siddhartha, who had been shielded from this, asked his charioteer what had happened to the man. The charioteer told him, "This is old age. It comes to everyone. to everyone. The words landed differently than they would on someone who had always known this. For Siddhartha, who had grown up in a world where everyone was young and healthy and beautiful, this was not a familiar fact. It was a rupture. He went out again and saw a sick man, feverish, in pain, the body turned against itself. And again the charioteer. This is sickness. It comes to everyone. He went out a third time and saw a corpse, the absolute stillness of a body from which whatever made it alive had completely departed. And again, this is death. It comes to everyone. 3 encounters, and the constructed world of the palace was in ruins. Not the physical palace, that still stood, beautiful and full of comfort, but the internal world that the palace had been designed to create. The sense that life was essentially pleasant, that the human condition was fundamentally manageable, that was gone. Siddhartha had seen what is always true and almost always hidden, that every human body is impermanent, that everyone who loves you will age and get sick and die, that everyone you love will too, that the pleasant surface of ordinary life is floating on something the palace walls had been keeping out of sight. Psychologists would recognize what happened to Siddhartha as a form of existential confrontation. The moment when the comfortable stories a culture tells about reality prove insufficient to contain the actual facts of existence. The stories crack, and through the crack, something that was always true but always managed becomes suddenly, unavoidably present. The 4th sight was different. On a 4th journey outside the palace, Siddhartha saw a wandering ascetic, a man who had renounced the world and was walking with nothing, in simple robes, with an expression of complete inner calm. And something in Siddhartha recognized what he was looking at. Not happiness exactly, not pleasure. Something steadier than either, a quality of being at peace with reality rather than protected from it. He had found, without quite knowing it, the direction he was going to walk. That night, Siddhartha looked at his sleeping wife and infant son, at the palace that had held his entire life, at everything that was genuinely good and beautiful in his constructed world, and he left. This is, in the tradition, called the Great Departure, and it is worth sitting with, because it is often misunderstood. Siddhartha was not running away from responsibility. He was not a man who couldn't handle ordinary life. He was not choosing the spiritual over the human. He was following something that had become impossible to ignore. Every sensitive person has experienced a version of this moment, not necessarily as dramatic, not involving a palace or a spiritual journey, but the moment when something you have seen or understood makes a particular kind of life no longer possible, when you cannot go back to not knowing, when the comfortable construction has cracked badly enough that continuing to live inside it would require a kind of dishonesty you can no longer sustain. Siddhartha left not because he didn't love his wife and son. He left because he had seen something that made staying, in the form that staying was available to him, a form of sleep he could no longer manage. He walked out into the forest and didn't look back. For 6 years, Siddhartha practiced the most extreme asceticism available in the ancient Indian tradition. He joined a group of other seekers, 5 ascetics, who were also searching for liberation from suffering, and together they pushed the body to its absolute limits. They fasted until they were skeletons. They held their breath until they passed out. They exposed themselves to extreme heat and cold. They denied the body everything it asked for, on the theory that the body was the problem, that desire itself was the source of suffering, and that if desire could be starved, liberation would follow. Siddhartha did all of this with the same intensity he had brought to everything else. He became, by all accounts, the most extreme ascetic anyone had ever seen. His ribs showed through his skin. His eyes sank into his skull. He was, in the most literal sense, destroying himself in pursuit of understanding. And nothing happened. Or rather, something happened, but not what he was looking for. The extreme asceticism produced altered states, physical experiences, the particular clarity that comes from depriving the body of what it needs. But it did not produce the understanding he was searching for. It produced suffering of a different kind, and it left him one day so weak that he could not even sit upright. A young woman named Sujata, passing by, offered him a bowl of rice milk. He accepted it. The 5 ascetics who had been practicing with him were disgusted. They had been pursuing purity through denial, and here was Siddhartha, their most extreme member, accepting food. They left him, believing he had given up. But Siddhartha had not given up. He had understood something. The extreme rejection of the body was not freedom from desire. It was desire in reverse, an equally violent relationship with the body, pointing in the opposite direction. Starvation was not the opposite of indulgence. It was indulgence's mirror image. Both were forms of obsession. Both were ways of making the body the entire story. What he was looking for was somewhere in the middle. Not the palace, not the forest floor. Something he began to call, in his later teaching, the middle way. Siddhartha walked to a fig tree, a Bodhi tree, the tree of awakening, on the banks of the Niranjana river at Bodh Gaya. He sat down beneath it, and he made a decision that was both very simple and almost unimaginably difficult. He decided not to move until he understood, not to get up and keep searching, not to try another technique, another teacher, another path, to simply sit, fully present, fully awake, fully willing to encounter whatever was actually true, and wait for understanding to come to him, rather than chasing it. This is, psychologically, one of the most radical acts in the entire story, because everything that had come before it, the palace, the departure, the asceticism, had been, in its different ways, a form of running toward comfort, running away from reality, running toward liberation through denial. All of it was movement, urgency, the relentless human impulse to do something about the situation. The tree was the first time he stopped. The tradition tells us that through the night, Siddhartha was visited by Mara, a figure of temptation and doubt. Mara sent his daughters to seduce him, sent his armies to frighten him, whispered every reason to give up, to move, to find another approach, to accept that this wasn't working. Mara is, in the psychological reading, not a supernatural being, but the voice of the mind itself under pressure, the part of the psyche that cannot tolerate stillness, that generates distractions, fears, pleasures, reasons to move, anything to avoid the confrontation with what is actually true that stillness would require. Siddhartha sat through all of it. When Mara asked by what authority he sat in that place, what right he had to claim that sitting there in stillness might produce something worth producing, Siddhartha reached down and touched the earth. Just that, just the ground beneath him, as if to say, I am here, I am present. This is enough authority. Reality itself is the authority. And at dawn, something shifted. What Siddhartha understood under the Bodhi tree, is the subject of volumes of scholarship and centuries of debate, but at its most essential stripped of doctrine and institutional religion and the complex philosophical traditions that developed around it, what he understood was something deceptively simple. Suffering arises from craving, not from the world being as it is, not from the impermanence of things. Things being impermanent is just what is true. Suffering arises from our relationship with that impermanence, from the craving for things to be other than they are, from the insistence that what is pleasant should last forever and what is painful should never have been at all. The palace was craving in one direction toward pleasure, permanence, the management of reality so that only the pleasant parts are visible. The extreme asceticism was craving in the other direction, away from the body, away from desire, toward a purity that was itself a form of wanting something other than what is. Both were forms of the same fundamental suffering. Both were the mind in resistance to what is actually true. What he found under the tree, what he would spend the remaining 45 years of his life teaching, was that liberation is not found by getting what you want or by destroying what you want. It is found by changing your relationship with wanting itself, by seeing craving as craving, by being present with what is, rather than perpetually in negotiation with it. This sounds simple. It is not simple, but it is also, and this is what has kept people returning to this teaching for 2,500 years, true in a way that is recognizable to anyone who has ever watched their own mind. The mind craves. It always craves. It reaches for pleasure and recoils from pain, and spins stories about how things should be, and generates anxiety about whether they will be. This is what the mind does. It is not a flaw in the mind. It is just what the mind is. The question is whether you are identified with the craving, whether you are the craving, or whether there is some part of you that can observe the craving without being entirely consumed by it. That observing capacity, that small, quiet witness space, is what Siddhartha found under the tree. After his awakening, Siddhartha sat under the tree for several more days. He was, by all accounts, reluctant to teach, not out of pride, out of something closer to the opposite. He had found something that seemed to him so simple, so counterintuitive, so much at odds with everything that people were searching for, that he genuinely wondered whether anyone would be able to hear it. People search for solutions, for answers, for the thing that will finally make the situation okay. And what Siddhartha had found was not a solution in that sense. It was not a way of making the suffering go away. It was a way of relating to suffering differently. He walked to the deer park at Sarnath, near Varanasi, where the 5 ascetics who had left him had gathered. He sat down with them and began to teach, and what he taught was the middle way. Not pleasure, not pain, not the palace, and not the forest floor. Something in between, not as a compromise, but as a completely different orientation. The possibility of being fully present with experience, all of it, the pleasant and the painful, the wanted and the unwanted, without being at the mercy of it. The 5 ascetics, who had expected him to have given up, who had been prepared to ignore him, found themselves listening. There was something in the quality of his presence, something in the steadiness of him, something that was recognizably different from the person who had walked away from the palace 29 years earlier, that made them want to hear what he had to say. He taught for 45 years after that. He walked from city to city across the Gangetic plain, speaking to kings and farmers, to the very wealthy and the absolutely destitute, to people in every condition of human life. And what he consistently found, what the tradition recorded, and what continues to be recognized by anyone who looks honestly at their own experience, is that the suffering he had seen in the streets of Kapilavastu was not particular to one person or one circumstance. It was the human condition. And understanding it, really understanding it from the inside, was the beginning of something else. I want to stay with this for a moment before we move into the quiet, because the story of Siddhartha is not just a story about an ancient Indian prince who became a religious figure. It is a story about what every person does in their own way with the fact that life contains suffering. Some people build palaces, not literally but internally. They construct arrangements, relationships, routines that are designed to keep the harder realities of existence at a distance, to manage the visible surface of life so that what is painful or frightening or uncertain can be kept out of sight. And it works for a while. And then it doesn't. Some people go to the other extreme. They decide that if comfort was the problem, then the opposite of comfort must be the answer. That if wanting is the source of suffering, then destroying wanting must be liberation. And they pursue this with great intensity and find that it is simply a different form of the same problem. And some people eventually find their way to the tree, not necessarily literally, not necessarily through any formal practice or spiritual tradition, but to the place inside themselves where the running stops, where the craving to be somewhere other than here, to be someone other than this, to have things other than what is, where that craving is seen for what it is, without being followed. That moment of not following, of seeing the craving and not becoming it, is available in the smallest possible increments. In the moment of noticing that the mind wants something, and choosing, just once, just briefly, to simply be with what is instead. Tonight, for instance, I want to speak very slowly now, to whoever is still listening. 2,500 years ago, a man sat down under a tree and decided to stop running. He had run toward pleasure and found it insufficient. He had run away from pleasure toward pain and found that equally insufficient. And finally, exhausted, thin, having tried everything the world had to offer in both directions, he sat down. And in the sitting, he found something that all the running had been passing by. The present moment. Just this. Just here. Just the ground beneath him, and the tree above him, and the breath moving in and out of a body that was tired and human and impermanent and entirely, completely, actually alive. You are lying somewhere right now in a bed, in a room, in a city, in a country, and your mind is doing what minds do. It is reaching, or resisting, or planning, or replaying. It is somewhere other than here, in some version of yesterday or tomorrow, in some story about how things should be, or should have been, or might yet become. And underneath all of that reaching and resisting and planning and replaying, underneath all of it, there is just this: the breath moving in and out, the weight of the body on the surface beneath it, the room, the dark, the quiet. Just this. You don't have to understand anything tonight. You don't have to arrive anywhere or achieve anything or resolve anything. You only have to be here, as fully as you can manage in this moment, in this breath. That is the tree. Wherever you are, that is the tree. Let your breathing slow. Let the reaching quiet. Let the body be heavy and still and here. Let the mind If it wants to wander, wander and let it come back. Not forced, just gently, like water finding its level. You have been running for a long time. Tonight the tree is here. Sit down, rest. If this reached you tonight, leave a comment. Just your city and the time. And if you want more nights like this one, subscribe. We're here every Monday and Thursday. Same quiet place, same honest voice. Good night, wherever you are.